Jewish Christian Relations, the First Centuries, by Abel Mordechai Bibliowicz. Our conversation on Jewish Christian Relations, the First Centuries, will proceed according to the following sections. First, we shall present our distinguished guests. Then, we shall present a thematic foreword, followed by presentation of the Bibliowicz thesis. Then we'll move on to the Jewish-Gentile crisis in the Jesus movement, followed by Mark's characterization of the disciples. The next section will be the evolution of Jewish-Christian relations, and that will be followed by concluding remarks and then a Q&A session. First, I'd like to introduce Professor John Dominic Crossan. John Dominic Crossan, Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at DePaul University, known as Dom to his friends and colleagues, has written 30 books on the biblical tradition, but especially on the historical Jesus. His latest contribution being his insightful Render unto Caesar. Professor Crossan was co-chair of the Jesus Seminar, a group of biblical scholars who emphasized the historical context of the Jesus movement. He was also president of the Society of Biblical Literature in 2012. Among the scholars of the Jesus Seminar, he and Burton Mack advocated for a non-apocalyptic view of Jesus, at the time a pioneering perspective. Next, I'd like to introduce Professor Peter Phan. Until his recent retirement, Peter Phan was the inaugural chair of Catholic Social Thought at Georgetown University. A native of Vietnam, he has earned 3 doctorates and is the recipient of 3 honorary doctorates. Peter is also the author and editor of some 30 books. His many writings have been translated into 8 languages and have received many awards from professional societies. Being Vietnamese and a migrant has helped Peter create a distinctive space in the theological world, allowing others to see the value of Asians and migrants in their multi-layered and complex beliefs as contributing something valuable and even transformative to the traditional Western Christian theology and to the Western Christian Church. Peter has argued forcefully for a positive role for non-Christian religions. Due to his advocacy, Peter found himself at the center of theological scrutiny and controversy upon publication in 2004 of his book, Being Religious Interreligiously. His public response was published in 2017 under the title The Joy of Religious Pluralism, a work and title that do reflect Peter's inclusive heart and open mind. Professor David P. Gushee. David P. Gushee is Distinguished University Professor of Christian Ethics and formerly the Director of the Center for Theology and Public Life at Mercer University. He is also Chair of Christian Social Ethics at the Faculty of Religion and Theology at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, in cooperation with the International Baptist Theological Study Center, IBTS Center, in Amsterdam. Gushee is the elected past president of both the American Academy of Religion and the Society of Christian Ethics. He served as president of Evangelicals for Human Rights, now the New Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good, and helped draft the Evangelical Climate Initiative's call to action. Gushee has written nearly 30 books, is a columnist for Baptist News Global, and has written for Religion News Service, Christianity Today, The Washington Post, The Sojourners, among other publications. Thematic foreword. The traditional account of the birth of belief in Jesus has been internalized by clergy, scholars and believers and is deeply embedded in hearts and minds. For more than 1,500 years, the juxtaposition Christianity versus Judaism has been at the core of the Christian religion, culture and lore. The leap from this deeply embedded narrative to an intramuros perspective centered on a crisis within the Jesus movement requires considerable conceptual change and a new terminology. 2. An academic version of the Bibliowicz thesis was first published in Jews and Gentiles in the Early Jesus Movement, published by Palgrave, Springer Academic, 2013. Jewish Christian Relations the First Centuries, 2022, is a later version aimed at the general public and is available for free download at the SBL event catalogue or at academia.edu. Book formats at cost are available via Amazon. 3. The terms commonly used in academic studies of early Christianity reflect the lingering influence of orthodoxy over the discourse, leading to confusion and a truncated dialogue. To fit better the context of the first 3 centuries and to clarify it, the thesis uses the terms belief in Jesus and Jewish and Gentile followers of Jesus for the first 3 centuries of the Common Era. The Bibliowicz thesis proposes that Jewish Christian relations stand on a complex trajectory that originates in a Jewish-Gentile crisis within the Jesus movement, between Jewish and Gentile followers of Jesus, not between Christians and Jews. This crisis erupted onto the surface following the Jewish War of 70 CE, but originated in earlier tensions within the Jesus movement. The thesis explores the context, background, and intent of the authors of the Gospels and later texts. These texts, written after Paul's ministry, do not describe, for the most part, the reality of the birth and first decades of belief in Jesus. They were crafted to promote theological and sectarian agendas relevant to contemporary audiences. The existence of tensions between Jewish and Gentile followers of Jesus is clearly attested to in the New Testament texts and has been widely noted and elaborated upon by scholars. The Bibliowicz thesis differs in the suggestion that this Jewish-Gentile crisis is the engine, the originating crucible, behind the Gentile challenge to the authority and legitimacy of the Jewish followers of Jesus as the exclusive guardians of Jesus' legacy and its momentous consequences. The internal debate within the Jesus movement about Torah observance by Gentiles eventually and gradually turned into an emotionally charged Jewish-Gentile crisis. The thesis advocates that the loss of this original context and later intra-Gentile agendas and circumstances resulted in the projection onto Judaism of the polemic that accompanied these early debates about what traditions and beliefs should ground belief in Jesus. The Bibliowicz thesis places this crisis center stage as the engine in a process that lasted several centuries, whereby early Gentile believers gradually transitioned from yearning for fellowship with the Jewish followers of Jesus to militant anti-Judaism. This progression from failed fellowship to militant anti-Judaism took place in different communities at different paces.
Let me begin by congratulating you on this beautiful book that you have written. Now, let me say that I am in full agreement with your thesis, we call Bibliowicz thesis, and which is this, that the debate, the controversy, the early controversy in the New Testament was not between Judaism and Christianity. Now, this has been the framework for almost 2,000 years of discussions, and I think you are right to say that it is very misleading. It was not a debate or controversy between Judaism as a religion and Christianity as an emerging religion. Rather, as you correctly pointed out, the controversy is between the Jewish followers of Jesus and the Gentile followers of Jesus, mostly under the leadership of Paul. Therefore, the debate, the controversy was not between two different religions, but happened within the Jesus movement. It's within the movement that emerged. We call it the Jesus movement. So I think that you have set the correct terms, the correct framework for understanding the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. I think this is a very important point you make. The implications of this is tremendous. The implications of thesis for theology, Christian theology, for the relationship between Jews and Christians today are immense. So we hope we have the chance to talk about this, in particular with regard to what we call the supersessionism, the idea that somehow Christianity has replaced, abolished, and replaced Judaism. So that I agree with this, your basic.
To be a great pleasure, really, first, and also a high honor to be with you and our confreres around the world in the SBL. Let me think with you now for a second, because I'm very close to agreeing with you. I think myself that the great parting of the ways, the irrevocable parting of the ways, was not about theological issues, but about slaughter. So I think the war, not any theological debate. I think, I'm sorry, as a theologian, I think theological debates can always be solved unless political power enters in, unless there's some other issue.
Well, I would first like to say a word of congratulations to my friend Abel Bibliowicz for the achievement of this book. And I'm glad that SBL has understood the significance of this project and has given this session in this meeting here. It is quite an achievement. And I think it is an important opportunity for Jewish, Christian, scholarly, and regular people conversation about the tragic brokenness that developed in the relationship between Jews and Christians, and that led to such awful, disastrous fruit, bad fruit. And so I think this is an important occasion in Jewish Christian conversation. I was among those who was essentially taught the story that the Bibliowicz thesis is trying to challenge, that the obvious anti-Jewish language of the New Testament represented a dispute between two groups that were already differentiated: Christians who believed in Jesus as Messiah and Jews who did not, sometimes shorthanded as the church versus the synagogue. And so the debate had to do with the church attacking the synagogue, Christians attacking Jews in the New Testament. But I think that is clearly a retrojection back onto the New Testament of realities that were much more obvious later than they were in the first century, if they even existed in the first century. The hypothesis that what we're really seeing in the text is bitter tensions between Gentile believers in Jesus and Jewish believers in Jesus who had perhaps tried and failed to achieve that one new humanity that is talked about, for example, in Ephesians chapter 2, that project had failed, that Jewish believers in Jesus and Gentile believers in Jesus eventually, at least, were unable to find the common terms for being in community together, and that the tensions got embedded in the text of the New Testament, so that, the thesis goes, when it sounds like attacks on quote unquote the Jews, what we have are probably attacks on by Gentile believers, some of them, on Jewish believers, some of them at least, with whom they could not agree over who was properly interpreting what it meant to follow Jesus. The role of Torah observance was a big part of that, but I also think there must have been just broader cultural differences as well. And that these leave like landmines in the New Testament that are then easily swept up into later Christian polemic against the Jewish people as a whole. I do think this is a really interesting thesis. It builds on, but also extends what has been argued before. And so I think it is a conversation well worth having. And the details need to be looked at, case by case, book by book, verse by verse. But that hypothesis makes a lot of sense to me. And the tragedy of this, that you have a dispute within the early Christian movement that then gets embedded in texts that become canonical for people who leave behind the original conversation, but import the prejudice and the bias and the contempt or the contemptuous sounding language. That's a tragic history, and I think it maybe helps us make sense of what developed in the long and awful history of Christian teaching of contempt for Jews.
The Jewish-Gentile crisis in the Jesus movement. According to Paul, the standing of Gentiles before God was to be based solely on their faith in Jesus' death and resurrection. Paul defended the rights of Gentile converts to be full and rightful heirs to the promise of God to Israel, without requiring from them Torah observance. However, soon after the first successes of Paul's mission to the Gentiles, tensions arose as converts to Paul's form of belief in Jesus encountered Jewish followers of Jesus in the public arena. It seems that some, maybe most, of Jesus' disciples and initial followers conditioned the fellowship on Torah observance, and may have considered Gentile forms of belief in Jesus insufficient and lacking, setting the stage for a bitter confrontation. Pauline communities experiencing anxiety and doubt caused by this crisis needed reassurance and guidance. They needed a legitimating foundational discourse, a dissonance-reducing narrative. In the New Testament, we can identify attempts by Gentile leaders to reassure the Gentile rank and file that they were rightful followers of Jesus, despite their rejection of the beliefs and religious traditions espoused by Jesus and by those chosen by him to be the custodians of his legacy.
What did happen was the embedding of hostility against the Jewish side in the Gentile-dominated literature that became canonical, and then, of course, everything that happened after that. So in a sense, the tragedy is that the success of the evangelistic movement in the Gentile world created a dynamic that ultimately led to an unbridgeable gap between Jewish believers in Jesus and Gentile believers in Jesus. So the way you put it in the book, that from the Jewish side, Jewish believers' side, it would inevitably look like the Gentile believers were abandoning Torah. And from the Gentile side, it would inevitably look like the Jewish believers were attempting to quote unquote Judaize. I think that was tragically inevitable, and every effort to split that gap, to find a way to hold everybody together, ultimately failed.
Excellent introduction to the topic, the conflict between the Jewish and Gentile followers of Jesus. I welcome your remark that we should not use the word Christian or church at this stage of the history, but rather use the term Jewish and Gentile followers of the Jesus movement. So that's a good detailed clarification. With regard to your point, I agree wholeheartedly that the conflict that arose between the Jewish and the Gentiles followers of Jesus had implication for the issues of who are the legitimate followers of Jesus, what are the conditions for a rightful and full discipleship to Jesus, number one, and number two, who can have the authority, whether the exclusive authority to decide what is genuinely requirement, the general requirement to be disciples of. First question, that the Gentiles, according to Paul, have the full rights to claim that they are authentic and disciples of Jesus. And that, of course, have implication on the question whether the observance of Torah, the Torah observance, is the requirement. The second question that you make, and I think is very, very interesting, it has not been acknowledged or observed by most scholars, is that the Gentile reaction to the observance of Jewish of the Torah observance questioned and finally rejected the exclusive authority of the followers, the Jewish followers of Jesus, to decide what is authentic, what is true, what is absolute requirement for being disciples of Jesus. This questioning of the authorities of the Jewish followers of Jesus was at first implicit, of course, but eventually it emerged as important doctrinal, no longer ritual, but doctrinal issues, namely who has the authority to determine the authenticity, the truth of the teaching. So this, I think the second point you made is very welcome, and I think we need to pay more attention to it.
Mark's characterization of the disciples. Contrary to the almost universal veneration of the disciples of the founder in other world religions, Mark and the synoptics that stand on his work is unique in his denigration and belittling of the disciples, those whom Jesus chose as custodians and guardians of his legacy. Those who knew Jesus best, the ones who shared his ethnicity, his religion, his journey, and his worldview, are the targets of Mark's accusations and innuendo. What is it that the disciples who shared Jesus' ministry, as well as his ethnicity, religion, and sociocultural background, did not know or understand? What is it that Mark, who did not know Jesus and whose background and life experience were alien to his, did know that his disciples did not? According to the Bibliowicz thesis, the Markan framing of disciples who do not understand Jesus' ministry and abandon him in his moment of need seems aimed to explain to recent Gentile converts the conundrum posed by the Gentile rejection of core beliefs and traditions espoused by Jesus and by those chosen by him to be the caretakers of his legacy. The author of the earliest gospel has superb timing. He rides on a growing wave of pagan conversion to belief in Jesus and capitalizes on the collapse of his adversaries due to the decimation of the communities of the Jewish followers of Jesus in Judea during the Jewish War. The author of Mark was amazingly successful as well. He drives a permanent wedge between Jesus and his Jewish disciples, a wedge that became canonical.
Thank you. I'd like to share my final thought on the topic that is so interesting. First of all, I have to thank you profoundly, Bill, for drawing attention to the Gospel of Mark. I did not pay such close attention to the gospel until your book pointing out of this Markan under almost attack of the Jewish followers of Jesus. So that, I think, is your great contribution. As I said last time, I think you have a certain point there. I wouldn't put Mark as a supersessionist thinker, but his framework, his narrative, his theological narrative may give rise, or maybe has given rise to the thought, to the idea that somehow Jewish followers of Jesus have no longer that authority, exclusive authority to impose orthodoxy on Christianity. On the other point, I also agree with you that the Markan avoidance of Roman responsibility, or the anti-Roman, avoid the anti-Roman rhetoric, has been very responsible for the emergence of the idea that somehow Jews are responsible for the Jesus' death.
Here I'm going to agree with you. You can't just read Mark and say, oh, yeah. You have to ask why from beginning to end does he consistently and devastatingly, and I would say incredibly, denigrate the entire 12 and the relatives of Jesus. I think that just as much that stuff in chapter 3, it's unnecessary. Jesus doesn't have to say, those around me are my family. And that's not necessary. You could take it for granted that the family's on his side. So yes, where we absolutely agree is that Mark really needs a devastatingly strong explanation, because it is quite extraordinary. This is a consistent denigration all the way through of individuals who represent a tradition. Let me tell you what I think about Mark. First of all, I do notice that Matthew and Luke, I suspect, would be very surprised to find Mark still in there. As far as they're concerned, they took care of Mark. They cleaned him up. They absorbed him into themselves. And if he was too tough on Peter, well, Matthew took care of that. And Luke took care of Peter in the Acts. So both of them, I think, did a cleanup job, a damage control job on Mark. So in one sense, you're right. Nobody said, oh, he just said this about Peter and the relatives of Jesus, I would say as well. And no problem. You're quite right. It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. And it needs an extraordinary explanation. I think Mark was written for refugees. I think there's been a flood of refugees during the Jewish war, especially after the destruction of Jerusalem.
What I would say about your hypothesis is that whoever then wrote the Gospels had an opportunity, if they wanted to turn this into a critique of all things Jewish, his family, his disciples, the religious authorities, the lawyers, the scribes, the way the Torah was understood at least. And so it was usable for an anti-Jewish or anti-Jewish believer in Jesus polemic. But I don't want to say that the story itself is manufactured to create that effect. I think the story has a ring of historical plausibility, but that it has the potential to be subtly manipulated for a later agenda, I would grant.
Evolution of Jewish Christian relations. The trajectory from the anti-establishment rhetoric of the Jewish followers of Jesus to the emergence and consequences of supersession theology is complex, elusive, and layered. The Bibliowicz thesis suggests that this trajectory has 6 main components that lay fused, confused, and intertwined in the texts. Although these components were necessary building blocks of the trajectory, a chronological sequence is not implied. Number 1, polemic by the Jewish followers of Jesus against the Judean establishment. Number 2, polemic by Gentile believers against the legitimacy, character, beliefs and traditions of the disciples, the founding fathers of the Jesus movement. Number 3, appropriation theology, the claim that Pauline believers in Jesus replaced the Jewish followers of Jesus as the new Israel, as God's new chosen. Number 4, decontextualization and subversion of the Judean tradition of self-criticism and prophetic anti-establishment censure. Number 5, supersession theology, the view that the Pauline interpretation of Jesus' legacy replaced and annulled the beliefs and traditions espoused by Jesus and by his first followers. And number 6, later loss of this context, fusion, confusion, and misinterpretation of these rhetorical layers and their projection onto Judaism.
I'd like to point out immediately that you have done very well in isolating these 6 components: layered, fuse, and intertwined. But it is not chronological. So that when you read the 6 elements, do not think that these are chronologically happen. They happen more or less at the same time. They confuse, they fuse, they mix together. So that's important. It is not a chronological elaboration of how supersessionist theology emerged.
I think this is a move that is helpful. Maybe one way to say it is that the basis of salvation is now belief in Jesus and his atoning sacrifice on the cross. The people who believe that are the ones who are the proper followers of Jesus. The people who don't believe that don't get it, and that distinction would correspond with the founding Jewish Torah observant movement versus the Pauline movement.
I see rabbinic Judaism and Christianity, and you can argue which is more in the biblical tradition or the Jewish tradition, as common offshoots. And if I could play with Paul's metaphor, it's almost like a single olive tree that branches out into 2 olive trees, two valid olive trees from the same root.
Number 1, polemic by the Jewish followers of Jesus against the Judean establishment. The Bibliowicz thesis suggests that, at first, allegations against the Jewish authorities, distinct from later attacks on the Jews, may signal that we are reading textual traces of Jesus' disciples and first followers filtered through the prism of Gentile editing. This would be a Qumran-like sectarian layer of confrontational rhetoric, originating in the relationship between the Jewish followers of Jesus and establishment Judaism.
Let's make it very clear that the criticism that the earliest followers of Jesus made against the Jewish establishment was not an outlier. They were not the only one. You mentioned the Qumran community. The Qumran community criticized, rejected the priesthood of the temple, right? And then within, so Qumran represent a radical departure from the Jewish establishment, particularly the temple, the priesthood, and so forth. That's number 1. So the critique of that Christian, the Jesus movement made against Judaism was not the only one. It's just part of a lot of different sects. So there is already within the Jewish establishment diversity of view, diversity of school, diversity of interpretation of the Torah. There is a lot already within the Jewish establishment, varies the conflictive interpretation of scripture. So I agree with this. It is important to see that the debate.
Yes, and if anyone brought that up to me, I would say, yeah. And again, read Josephus on what happens when the forces arrayed against the Romans come into Jerusalem. Look what they do to the high priestly family of Annas. So if I looked at Josephus and I looked at the gospel, I would find that Josephus is telling me of Jewish people, not followers of Jesus, who are even more against the Judean establishment.
I see Jesus as a radical, maybe Qumran-like prophet, challenging the legitimacy of all of the above, and his first followers would have picked that up as well. And we actually see traces of that in the book of Acts, for example. So yeah, all of that is plausible to me, and then that could be edited to be later and interpreted as the Jews are bad, right? And I think that that is what gets picked up in the tradition.
Number 2, polemic by Gentile believers against the Jewish followers of Jesus. Most Gentile converts seem to have resented the attempt to impose the beliefs and traditions of the founding generation as a requirement for being recognized as legitimate followers of Jesus. These beliefs and traditions, while integral and intrinsic to Jesus and to his Jewish followers, were alien to most non-Jewish converts and consequently emerged as wedge issues. The Bibliowicz thesis points out that the Pauline mission to the Gentiles evolved in opposition to the Jewish followers of Jesus, and would have directed its sectarian and militant rhetoric first and foremost toward them, not toward Judaism as commonly understood. Initially, the issues that the authors were trying to address, the frame of reference, the horizon, the intended adversaries, and the context, seem to have been within the Jesus movement.
That's the dispute. That's the older traditional interpretation that you are challenging and proposing, that there is some retrojection back into these accounts, but it would have been of internal disputes within the Christian community between Torah observant and non-Torah observant followers, probably largely corresponding to Jews versus Gentiles. That's a really, really interesting proposal. And so you can kill two birds with one stone. You can have Jesus arguing with Pharisees, and we can be arguing against our Torah observant Jewish brothers from this other side of the fence, and you can achieve both with the same story. I think that's very plausible, and I think that needs to be entered into the conversation about how we interpret these passages, for sure.
You are right from the historical standpoint. The rhetoric that you find among the non-Jewish, the Hellenistic and the Gentiles, followers of Jesus, contributed, no doubt, contributed to the supersessionist theology. In Christian writing of so-called Christology, one of the key points they make all the time, that Jesus was a Jew and a pious Jew, observant Jew. To begin combating supersessionism, this is the point you have to make. Jesus, and not only Jesus, but all his earliest disciples were Jews, faithful Jews. His mother, Mary, and the disciples, the so-called apostles, were all Jews. So rejecting Judaism is rejecting Jesus himself. This is a very important that need to be stressed, that Jesus was a pious Jew. He observed the Jews, the Jewish law, the Torah.
Number 3, appropriation theology. The Bibliowicz thesis yields that the Pauline claim to the identity, authority, and legitimacy of the Jewish founding fathers resulted in the appropriation and decontextualization of their law, including their self-perception as the new Israel, their anti-Jewish establishment posture, and the Judean traditions of prophetic self-criticism. This wide-ranging subversion and appropriation was a consequence of the assertion, innocuous on first sight but enormously consequential, that the Gentile followers of Paul superseded and replaced the Jewish followers of Jesus as the new people of God, as the new Israel. To delegitimize the Jewish followers of Jesus, and at the same time claim to be their theological heirs, required great linguistic, polemical, and rhetorical ability, but created great logical and theological difficulties. Gentile authors tried to wrestle with this conundrum throughout the canonical and the authoritative texts, and invested great effort in delegitimizing the theological narrative from which they longed to derive their legitimacy.
What you point out in the book is, from a Jewish perspective, the theological work that is done, even in this supposedly sophisticated book of Hebrews, just doesn't hold together as a Jewish reading. It's a new thing. It doesn't work. It's not really Jewish, but it's an appropriation.
You have the whole literature of how the term Pharisee has been, as you said, appropriated as the one who is hypocritical, narrow-minded, legalistic. The whole Christian literature on the Pharisees emphasized, appropriated precisely the critique of the earliest followers of Jesus against certain sects, certain schools within Pharisaism, among the teachers of the law. So they use it, appropriate it, and then applied on, as you said, put it onto the Jews in general or the Pharisees in general. So one of the key biblical New Testament scholarship is to understand who were the Pharisees, who are they, what did they represent, and so forth.
Number 4, decontextualization and subversion. Judean self-criticism and Judean anti-establishment rhetoric, the quarry where many Pauline polemical stones originate, do reflect Jewish humility and the traditional Judean inclination to chastise and humble the people and its leaders. This unique Israelite tradition of self-criticism was harnessed by Pauline thinkers to justify the Jewish forfeiture of God's favor, i.e., the transfer of God's favor from the founding faction to the Gentile followers of Paul. These assertions and the appropriation of the Jewish scriptures gradually morphed into claims to the supersession of Judaism by Christianity. Ironically, the lore of the Jewish founders of the Jesus movement turned out to be a trove of anti-establishment polemical arrows that Gentile believers could use to denigrate the Jewish establishment of the movement. In the anti-Jewish establishment traditions of the Jewish followers of Jesus and other Judean sectarians, Pauline leaders found a ready-to-deploy arsenal that could be used to demote the Jewish establishment of the Jesus movement.
So as many elements of Hebrew Bible as could be deployed for the purpose of a supposed continuity, all of it was necessary. And that would include not just some of the ones that you've named, but also, say, the idea that Jesus is in the Davidic line. So you need to do that whole lineage thing, right? The idea of Messiah being clearly taught in the Hebrew Bible and Jesus clearly fulfilling the messianic prescriptions. The idea of Hebrew Bible prophecies being fulfilled in Jesus, and then all the stuff about covenant and Torah and sacrifice and priesthood and temple, all of it needed airtight fulfillment, supersession fulfillment, continuity. So I think that the decision to remain, to claim continuity and to keep the Hebrew Bible is also part of the story that you were telling. But in the end, it's a Gentilized version, and what Gentile Christians make of the Hebrew Bible often has little or no resemblance to what actual practicing Jews either made of the Hebrew Bible 2,000 years ago or make of it today.
I think Gentile Christians did terrible things here. For example, they often told stories that were based on prophetic fulfillment and then upbraided the Jewish authors for not seeing what they had fulfilled in them, as it were. So yes, the prophetic self-criticism was used regularly.
The Old Testament, the Hebrew scripture, prophets critique the priesthood, the people in general. That kind of critique was then appropriated by Christians, right? They were appropriated to identify themselves, to give themselves legitimacy by saying, well, look, even the Jewish prophets themselves were critical, were highly critical, rejected the people. And one of them promised the new covenant, Jeremiah. Talk about the new covenant, the covenant that made of flesh, not of stone. So Christians appropriated this prophetic criticism of the Jewish establishment and say, look, we are not doing something new. We simply repeat what the prophets were saying. And I said, this is so pernicious, so dangerous. It is an abuse of biblical Hebrew text for Christian purposes. To identify themselves, to legitimize themselves, to say that now we are the true Israel, the new Israel, the verus Israel, that we say, the true Israel. And this use of the prophetic criticism, as I said, is absolutely perverse. And we have to be very careful of that. And all the Hebrew prophets are now used their words as weapons against the Jewish people in favor of Christianity. So I agree with you on this, and I agree. I would strongly warn Christian preachers, priests, catechists, when they use the Hebrew scripture, have to be very careful, just not misappropriating, misuse the prophetic self-criticism.
Number 5, supersession theology. According to the Bibliowicz thesis, supersession theology emerges out of the claim that the Pauline interpretation of Jesus' legacy replaced and annulled the beliefs and traditions espoused by Jesus and by his first followers.
Is the context of Christian preaching and worship. It's very important to notice these two contexts. The context of preaching, it's almost axiomatic, I may say, to be anti-Jewish in preaching, that has made use of terrible use of the parables, certain parables in which Jews and Pharisees are cast in extremely negative light. Another dimension I mentioned last time, bear repeating, is the way how Christians have used of the prophets critique of Israel, the people of Israel, and use it as to justify the fact that the view that the Jews were, again, hard-headed, refused to follow Jesus. So that's one part. The second context is the liturgical or the worship context. And I like to mention in particular the so-called Holy Week ceremonies, where there were prayer on Holy Friday for the Jews, for their hard-headedness, So that sort of liturgy that portrayed Jews as God killer, the killer of God and the rejection of Jesus and so forth. So there are two sides, the preaching side, the homiletic side, and the liturgical side.
One bit of pushback I might offer is to say that the Orthodox or proto-Orthodox Christian tradition ends up claiming legitimacy over against the interpretation of the Jewish followers of Jesus. That I think works. To say that it sets aside or like self-consciously replaces and annuls the religion of Jesus himself, I think is a harder stretch for us as Christians. I mean, even that's me speaking for just a moment as a believer, but stepping back, even as a scholar, what I think the Gospels try to do is to say that Jesus himself held an attitude toward Torah, for example, that ends up consistent with what the Orthodox Christian tradition ends up embracing.
But then the Romans would be at it with a microscope. See, you're a new religion. So supersession is a necessity of appealing to the Romans. It has no intrinsic logic. You could simply say, we're us and we're right and you're wrong. It's sort of the evidence and the giveaway that you have not yet found your own identity securely.
Number 6, projection onto Judaism. The incorporation and appropriation of the traditions and scriptures of the Jewish followers of Jesus by the Gentile followers of Paul eventually morphed into claims to the supersession of Judaism by Christianity, and into the Christian self-perception as the new Israel and the new people of God. Arguments originally deployed by the Jewish followers of Jesus against the Judean establishment, you have lost God's favor, we are God's new chosen, we are the new Israel, we embody a new covenant, the temple and the priesthood are defiled and no longer authoritative, etc., etc., were appropriated and incorporated by the Pauline, intent on taking over the role of the Jewish followers of Jesus as the custodians of Jesus' legacy. The Bibliowicz thesis summarizes that although the original concerns, horizon, and adversaries were within the Jesus movement, somewhere along the way, and in the service of later agendas, authors and audience seem to have lost the distinction between the Jewish followers of Jesus, their Gentile sympathizers, and establishment Judaism. The 5 components surveyed above lay now fused, confused, and intertwined in the text. They eventually merged into an undifferentiated and tumultuous river of anti-Jewish incitement. Eventually, dynamics of fusion, confusion, extrapolation, and projection converted an internal debate about Judaism into undifferentiated anti-Judaism.
What you are, I think, successfully showing is it's not just that the canon can be used by anti-Semites to incite hatred, but that the canon itself has already got polemical elements, but that those polemical elements appear to have been internal to the Jewish, Gentile, Torah, non-Torah conversation within the early church in its first 150 or 200 years. And I think that makes sense. There's always been, I think you've deepened a hypothesis that has been in one way or another out there, but that it would then be led by or read by later readers as undifferentiated, toxic river of anti-Jewish incitement is a fact. And the only word I can use to describe this is tragedy. Just wanted to flag that powerful line about an undifferentiated and tumultuous river of anti-Jewish incitement. Yes, that is true. Yes, that is what develops in the tradition. And in your book, in the latter part, you give us just even a small set of examples of that anti-Jewish incitement. That is unknown to many Christians, even to this day, not to scholars. But it is, I would say, the worst legacy of Christianity, of ancient Christianity, to the world. Full stop.
I'd like to come back to the notion of new people of God, new Israel, and so forth. These kind of expressions that were very common in Christian theology. Again, in popular language, particularly at the level of preaching, liturgy, the expression old and new are still being used, and very often people hearing these terms are not sophisticated enough or are not familiar enough with the anti-Jewish rhetoric that underlie them, and so they implicitly, as you said it, they simply implicitly accept these ideas.
Now, we can debate all sorts of things, but let me be very clear where we agree. That any hint of anti-Judaism in the gospel that leads to, or is the seedbed for, or a hint of racial anti-Semitism is not just theologically wrong, but historically invalid and evil. So, I mean, that I don't want people to might hear, oh, they're debating this, they're debating that, Marcus. No, there is supersession, in the New Testament. It's there already. Whether you would find it in Mark and I would find it in Luke, that's worthy of arguing, but both of us find it there. Christian, let me use the language, Christian anti-Judaism became the seedbed of racial anti-Semitism. So I know where we got. And again, I want to repeat, where we got was a tragedy. I don't want in any way that any argument about the 2nd century or the 3rd century, or whether things could have gone differently. But I am quite ready to say, I think it would be better for Christianity if Jewish Christianity rather than Luke's Roman Christianity had become prevalent. Yeah.